hello. And yet again, caught unawares. Damn, this music, I cannot be prepared for some reason. Hi, how are you doing?
Good. Good to see you. Hey,
Good to see you.
everybody. Welcome
Hi,
back to
everybody.
Disasters Deconstructed, season 11. We
From
are
random locations, like
from
unexpected
random
locations
locations.
today. I'm in Warwick, office courtesy of Pierre, which is beautiful. Look at all these books.
Amazing. I'm up on the lakeshore in Michigan in
Amazing.
a cabin. And but we are continuing with our 11th season,
The
bringing you
commitment.
episode 4. Our season 11 is about politics of disaster, and we have had 3 really fun episodes so far with Ricardo, Raja, and Karen. And if you haven't seen those, check out the recordings on YouTube. And we're going until October, I think, right? With
December, but we're gonna take like a
okay,
little break
a little break.
yeah.
Well, we're going for the rest of the year then with additional episodes in the same theme with really amazing guests we're so excited about. So yeah, our next one is
In
in
2 weeks'
2
time.
weeks.
But then there will be a special episode and we'll talk about it at the
Right.
end. But our episodes have been so fun that Meta blocks us on Facebook. This
Oh, no.
is how fun it
You're
got
going to
as
tell
well.
everybody about this?
Yeah, I mean, this is great. I feel like it's an achievement, you know?
Yeah. So we usually stream to YouTube and Facebook, but the first few episodes all got blocked by Meta.
Too funny.
And I think it was probably... Oh, no, the first one was fine. It was episode 2
Yeah, it
and
was the
3.
second. It was Swami.
I'm pretty sure it was Swani's
Rajaswami. Yeah, Rajaswami. Yeah,
scarf, yeah.
it was great. Anyway,
Yeah.
let's see what excitement we can bring today. I'm sure we can. And anyway, joining us today is Dr. Omar Ijazi. Really, really exciting to meet Omar. It's first time we're hosting him on podcast, and we've heard so much about Omar's work from AJ Faz, our very good friend, whom you've seen many times on podcast, and also. Omar has already done some work for Wicked Stars, the zine that, of course, we kind of publish as Radix sort of manifesto collective. So it's really nice to have Omar joining us today. Hi.
Hello.
Appeared by magic. So, quick introduction. Omar is a lecturer at the University of Manchester, and he's a critical disaster studies scholar and decolonial ethnographer. And Omar's work is really interdisciplinary. He works on interdisciplinary scholarship, and it is rooted in the insight that imperialism and settler colonialism have been ending indigenous, black, brown, and non-normative worlds long before the climate crisis. So this is going to be a really exciting conversation today. Welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, welcome, Omar. So we're going to start this off with a really fun question that we've been asking all our guests in this season, and we have some structure to our episodes with the start and end. But this question, it really elicits a range of responses, and it's really fun to kind of get to know you. So the first question is, what is a disaster for you?
I think, before I answer the question, it's kind of important to foreground the context and the communities that I work with, which I think has a very important bearing in how I understand the question of what is a disaster. So, I work primarily in the disputed territory of Kashmir. This is the Western Himalayan region, land under occupation, military occupation. Parts of it lie under the control of the nation states of India, Pakistan, parts of it even under China. This is a heavily militarized region. So, barbed wire, surveillance, clamp on political dissent, enforced disappearances, the whole spectrum of violence, essentially, right? And the people who live there, for decades, they've been fighting for their own freedom, for sovereignty, for liberation, or, Azadi in the local language. And not only, I think, has Kashmir been, historically, violently, forced into this very, carceral imagination of South Asia and its reliance on the nation state as, the ultimate adjudicator of life and politics, given its ecologically fragile location in the Himalayas, it's been increasingly also brought into the folds of disaster governance, through the use of language of risk, vulnerability, resilience, and the whole spectrum of words that we associate, with the field. But the whole, disaster governance apparatus seems to be overwhelmingly imagined as one that is, technocratic, apolitical, outside the broader textures of coloniality that structures life and disaster in Kashmir, right? So much so that disaster governance is sometimes weaponized to extend and erase questions of colonial occupation and militarization. For example, we have so many studies, kind of proving the point that militarization actually increases disaster vulnerability. For example, decades of extensive military infrastructure, cantonments, roads, bunkers, installations, they transform, ecologically fragile landscapes into, sites of, let's say, heightened flood risk, for example. And then occupation also reshapes land use. Military military occupation affects emergency response, for example. For example, if you're not allowed to have public spaces, what does that mean when it comes to evacuation and questions like that, right? So I think for me, I've coming to that question that there can be no consideration of what a disaster is in Kashmir and places like it outside of these wider considerations of occupation, settler colonialism, Islamophobia. Kashmir is a predominant Muslim region. Racial capitalism, border making, and all of these, larger questions, right? So how do you then talk about earthquakes and floods that doesn't erase this larger star city of the region, and does not reduce, the kind of the genius of the lives of people who live and thrive there, right? So I think for me, what a disaster is in my work, I try to look at through the lens of affect, and I try to give it a very atmospheric attention. So disaster is something that is omnipresent, that is everywhere. It's in the air, it's effervescent, it's ephemeral, it's in the ether, and something that's not reduced to a singular event. So it's not just, collapsing of your home during an earthquake, or loss of life because somebody shot at you across the border, but a way to capture, the affective embodiment of violence in a space where life is constantly diminished in so many fronts, right? So for me, I think the question is, how do you escape the boundedness of the term disaster and pay attention to these very minute kind of recesses of the everyday where violence and life kind of coexist? I think that's where the attention is needed when we say, what is a disaster, perhaps?
Mm-hmm. I'm very quickly understanding why AJ Fast sings your praises.
Yeah, absolutely. This is really fantastic. Thank you so much. You've kind of just started us, as we mean to go on, and we will come back and we will talk about your book, The Atmospheric Violence, in a few minutes.
Yeah.
But before that, I want to talk about your work in general. And so, I think our viewers and listeners already have understood, and even if they didn't know your work, that your work is very political, in a way that you decenter mainstream approaches to knowledge creation, to solidarity, to action, to disaster risk reduction in sort of mainstream way, right, in normative way. But obviously, such decentering requires resistance. So to you, what does resistance actually mean in a world that is marked by chaos, by contradiction, by complexity?
I think, great question. I think I've become kind of increasingly hesitant about treating resistance as the central way of understanding political life. And I say this because, in Kashmir, for example, where there's overwhelming intersecting forms of violence, people don't spend every moment resisting in ways that are visible or recognizable to outsiders or to ethnographers like myself, right? I mean, they also have to survive. They have to love, raise a family, grieve, cook, cultivate, repair, think of, different futures for themselves. So I think what interests me really is how these everyday practices create worlds that exceed the logics imposed by violence, right? So that resistance is not only about, saying no, it's about the patient labor of sustaining life despite systems that seek to make life essentially unlivable. So I think, the work that is quiet, that is relational, the work of refusing to allow violence to define the totality of one's existence, And I think decentering, mainstream knowledge is part of this, this work. And rather than asking people, how they resist power, maybe we can think of what forms of knowledge, care, repair already exists, in these worlds. And these, practices, often I think reveal, political imaginations that, that dominant frameworks, fail to recognize. So solidarity, for example, begins not by, speaking for people or celebrating, their heroic resistance, but by learning to inhabit their ways of knowing and maybe attending to what they themselves consider meaningful. So maybe then, knowledge becomes almost, a form of attunement rather than just capture, yeah.
And yeah, that's exactly that. So I'm at this conference today, kind of workshop, and we were talking about kind of very similar things with our friend Camilo Boano today, where resistance indeed doesn't mean kind of standing, at the front line or supporting the wall, but sometimes just challenging, that kind of moment of challenging can become a moment of liberation, and each moment sort of builds together, right?
Right.
And so I want to talk a little bit more about the sort of the idea of resistance as a non-violence in a very different kind of knowledge production way. So as I was preparing for this podcast, I was obviously doing mild stalking online, kind of learning about your research. And I learned that about the community center documentary cookbook that you're working on called Have You Eaten? That got me so excited. I've never really heard about documentary cookbook, and I just think it's just such a wonderful idea. So I wanted to tell us a little bit about the book, but I also want you to perhaps tell us a little bit more about your argument that flourishing is a form of resistance when it is happening in the context of destitution. So how did you come up with this idea of the documentary cookbook? And tell us more about kind of flourishing and what you're seeing on the ground.
Great. So I think, the cookbook, Have You Eaten, emerged, from this very simple, observation that across Kashmir and many regions of the world, I noticed that sometimes, the most important political conversations actually happened, not in interviews, not in, observational settings or public demonstrations, but as people prepare food, as they share meals, they cook recipes, they sit with their families or their comrades or their kin. So, the kitchen becomes, a space where, memory, grief, humor, aspirations all kind of circulate together, right? And this made me kind of rethink, what counts as political knowledge. So rather than treating food as only a topic of research, I began to think of cooking and eating as a methodology, as a way of knowing the world alongside the other worlds that are being brought into our purview, which cannot be captured, I think, through just participant observation or interviews or surveys and so forth, right? So I think that was, the real inspiration, how cooking becomes an entry point into the world and for us to attune to a different kind of knowing and relatability and relationality. And then, thinking more about flourishing, I think it's kind of interlinked, I think like, we can think of flourishing under conditions of continuous violence as a form of resistance. And I appreciate that impulse, but I think it's also important to understand flourishing on its own terms as a different and separate analytical category that is not subservient to the push and pull of resistance literature and the kind of imaginations that brings in theoretically, at least, or conceptually. So, like I said before, communities, live through occupation, they live through crime and crisis. They're not simply resisting power every waking moment in a traditional sense. They're also creating beauty, nurturing relationships, caring for one another, imagining futures. And these, I think, practices, deserve attention, not only because they oppose violence, but because they reveal worlds that violence can never fully contain, right? So the documentary cookbook tries to honor these worlds. It brings together recipes, oral histories, photographs, conversations around generations. And I think the recipes are important because they're a vehicle for documenting relationships to land, to memory, to family, to place. And my hope really is that the project invites readers to think differently about food, not simply as cultural heritage, but as a way of understanding care, sovereignty, collective life, and flourishing in its own kind of right, in its own kind of material right, in its own philosophical right, in the same way. Yeah, that's what I was going
Yeah,
about.
I mean, amazing. Cooking and eating as methodology. If you ever need anyone to try your methodology, like I'm up for it. Especially the eating fast. I'm not so sure about cooking. But no, joking aside, I just find it really fascinating because we've been talking a lot about creative methodologies and the ways that we produce knowledge, particularly for disaster studies. And this is something that
Right.
you're absolutely right, brings the kind of the ideas, that the context, right, that we're kind of trying to understand, to really understand what is the experience of harm and hardship. And I wonder how this would change given that the food scarcity that we're already seeing because of climate change, but also because of conflict, right? And how the kind of the stories change. What do you think? Do you think that kind of food scarcity would change the story and bring up the destitution more, or will we still be able to see the kind of flourishing
Right.
side?
I think the stories are changing, every day as we speak. Not just food scarcity is one, obviously climate change, but also
Yeah.
like militarization, how that
Mm.
interrupts the flow of ingredients, how that interrupts how people, associated with land. So, for example, a lot of the recipes that I encountered are all heavily based on very hyper local ingredients, for example, things that people have been growing for generations, and that then become a claim to the land because of their presence and the way they're articulated in food culture and memory and so forth. But if that's interrupted by landmines and barbed wire and borders, it's already there's a cut in those traditional use of those ingredients and that knowledge, those edibles and flowers and fauna and plants carry. It's already been an interruption, I think a massive interruption because of border making practices and militarization.
Mm.
But then people, change their recipes. They use alternative objects and ingredients, and that itself is a story in its own way, right? So
Mm.
in a changing world where land is being taken away, where the climate is changing, what new traditions of food or what improvisations are being made, and what does that tell us about the nature of violence, the nature of climatic change, the nature of occupation? So I think further clues are being offered even in those stories for us, I think.
Mm.
So I want to ask you about your book, Atmospheric Violence. In the book, you emphasize that disasters don't create suffering, but merely expose it, which is something we've talked about many times in different ways on our podcast. But you focus on the social labor through which people refuse the conditions of death imposed upon them and create viable lives for themselves. So this ties into the concept of vulnerability. Ksenia and I have been working with various colleagues on this concept for a long time. And in your work, you emphasize this labeling of vulnerability and the way it forecloses alternative ways of being sometimes. And you use this phrase, conceptual incarceration. So how to escape conceptual incarceration. So I wanted to ask you, first of all, what is that and how is it to be escaped from?
I mean, first of all, a great fan of your work. Both of you have read, a lot of your writings on vulnerability, and I think it remains an important concept. But I think in my work, my whole idea is how do we think of disasters when we take away the foundational blocks of disaster studies, which includes vulnerability
Mhm.
and resilience and recovery, and what if we replace them with reciprocity, with relationality, with repair, with solidarity? And what kind of world is imagined and what kind of disastered world is imagined from those perspectives, right? I think that's been the driving force in terms of moving away from these very useful, but also very kind of heavily, in my opinion, carceral designations of life, including vulnerability, which I think, is the dominant way in which, humanitarian studies, disaster studies, even anthropology often comes to know marginalized communities. And I think it risks becoming a very totalizing description. It risks reducing people to, what has been done to them rather than attending to what they do and what they know and how they, continue to go on living. Um, so I don't, in my book, I argue that disasters don't suddenly produce vulnerability or that they do not singularly produce
Mm.
vulnerability. Against the book is situated in Kashmir. There's a very specific context. Rather, they also illuminate histories of militarization, settler colonialism, environmental dispossession, political abandonment that have long structured, daily life, right? So, and I think a lot of disaster scholars have made similar assertions, like both of you are saying. But I think what interested me ethnographically was not simply, then, again, documenting the suffering and all of that, but, what is the labor of repair? How do people cultivate relationality, and community in the wake of disasters, not as coping strategies, but as political categories? So, how is creating the world, a rehearsal of a future in the present, right? In the kind of, so what are the speculative possibilities of creating worlds in the aftermath or amidst a disaster, right? And how do we capture those languages? Again, I think are foreclosed by the language of vulnerability, resilience, coping mechanisms, and so forth, right? And then I guess you're right. The important question then is, how do you escape, conceptual incarceration? And I think as academics, we love making new words. Make up a new word. That's one option. Or we kind of rescue an existing word and try to embed it with deeper meaning and different kind of politics. That's another option. Those are those two. But maybe I think conceptual incarceration, how to escape it, for me is more of an ethical practice than an intellectual practice, I would say. It's an ethical practice of attention, requires, approaching people with the possibility that they exceed the categories we have prepared for them. The life is, always more unruly, is always more excessive. It is always more surprising than our analytical frameworks can possibly allow. I think that's what I mean by returning to the fugitivity of life. Like, life is constantly escaping our attempts to stabilize it, right? And I think this also makes me think differently about solidarity. So solidarity is not built by assuming, we already know what people need or what political language best represents them, but you risk being transformed by encounter with them, right? So how do you become more comfortable when our own categories destabilize, and in that process we ourselves become destabilized, right? Because these concepts, they're bread and butter. I understand that, and we write for them, we create them, we nourish them, we invest our intellectual thought into them, but they're never going to be enough in the way, in this kind of way, I would say, right? So how do we lose our attachment to these concepts? I think and we become okay with the uncertainty and that vulnerability of doing so, right? I think that's my understanding of how do you escape conceptual carcerality, like as an ethical practice, as a practice of solidarity, but also equally intellectual, for sure.
Yeah, I think for me it also raises the tensions of doing engaged work with people who are living in conditions that we are kind of creating categories for and trying to understand,
right,
as scientists.
Right.
And as soon as you fail to listen first before assigning your category, you've made a misstep. And I think, and we've talked about this before many times and written about just the tension in disaster studies between different trainings and backgrounds, and
right.
What we've been trained to see as robust research methods and methodologies, and philosophies. And so there's like tension within the field,
For sure.
as to how we work with communities. And to me, or this thinking about concepts raises those tensions,
Right. And also, like, going back to the same kind of consideration, that is knowledge a form of capture? Is it a form of attunement? Like, are we looking to extract and extract and extract and solidify something, or are we looking to just be invited into this world where we are offering glimpses of the genius of people's lives at best, and we think through with that? And are we comfortable with that? Is that sufficient for us as scholars, as investigators, as however we call ourselves, right? And also kind of unsettles our expertise, like, radically, and our desire for expertise, right?
Yeah, we had a good discussion at the Hazards Workshop last week, aligned to this, and Susanna Hoffman was in the audience actually asking some questions. And anyway, we were talking just about the ethics of engaged research and not co-creating knowledge with communities, and this issue of just how to avoid, or how to listen, for scientists to be more like a resource that extends what's possible in terms of what the community can build for themselves, and to be comfortable in that position where you may be called upon to lend expertise or resources, but they might not need you as well, and that's a good thing. So
I mean, often in my spaces, I'm not needed for anything. They're like, who are you? Who are you? What are you doing? Like,
yeah,
I'm not seen as an expert most of my field contexts, right? I'm seen as a visitor, as a guest.
right.
That's it.
Yeah. But I think it's that kind of acknowledgement within ourselves, right, as scholars, as academics, that we cannot really truly understand what others are experiencing and facing, right? No matter how well we know that person, because we're not them. And so, I think what we need to understand is that there is absolutely no way that we can be like the expert on the other person, and I think that's what we're kind of failing to do, right, as a general academic community. And so obviously, therefore, we need to rethink like expertise overall, conceptually, intellectually, ontologically, and maybe we should see expertise then as the kind of as the responsibility to engage like relationally, right, and to acknowledge the limits of our own perspective, and that might help understanding what is happening. But that is uncertain, right, and that is kind of uncomfortable, as you said just now.
Yeah, and also, like, how do we write in ways that extend people's desires for sovereignty and freedom? That's a very different intellectual question or intellectual project than what we're trained to do as academics in our jobs in our universities, right? Like, for Kashmiri, in my relationship with people of Kashmir, is how do I create the conditions for them to continue talking about sovereignty and politics and liberation in ways that are useful and suitable for the people who live in that site of occupation. My job is not to define that, but just to, at best, create a pathway for those conversations to happen.
Yeah.
Right? There's a very different understanding of how we place ourselves as disaster scholars in a very charged, I think, political landscape. And I think all our landscapes are politically charged, not just Kashmir. Right?
Yeah, not just landscapes. I mean, that leads us to our last question, which I will ask, and then I want to come back to a few things that you've said, just because you've given us such a nice segue. So again, we're asking every guest in this season. As you acknowledged, disaster scholarship is kind of generally apolitical, right? Because we want to step away and observe, and I'm using quotation marks here, and the argument for scholarship in general, being quite apolitical, is that then we can remain objective, right? And that is clearly the best thing that can happen to us in academia. So how do we challenge this? How do we move disaster scholarship and scholarship in general from this kind of nonsense argument that we must remain objective and therefore apolitical? Otherwise, we can't make sense of the world.
I mean, like, feminist scholars have, debunked this myth in the 80s, right? Like, how everything is situated and positional. And, so, like, maybe our job is to read outside disaster studies, like, first step. Like, maybe,
Thank you.
Stop quoting, stop quoting the disaster study gods or whatever you call, the canonical figures. I'm not going to name any. Just like top them off for a bit.
God's nest. We're calling them the gods for sure.
Yeah,
like, chop them, park them on the side, bracket them a lot more than we are used to or more confident in doing so. And what if you cite Audre Lorde? What if you read, all these other radical traditions of feminist knowledge and Black scholarship that has given us so much more to think about? And what is politics? What is solidarity? What is knowledge? There's a whole legacy of Black radical, women of color critique that is so amazingly useful for disaster scholars that we have very little connection with as scholars. And I say this also about myself, somebody who has to untrain myself as a disaster scholar and retrain myself as something else. So that, so maybe that's the step, right? Just like, stop being so devoted to the field. It's not the field that we're working for. It's the context. It's the communities.
Yeah. Yeah, but the gods, the gods don't want. This is the best. The gods don't want to kind of step from their Olympus mountain, right? And this is the issue that Jason and I faced, and I'm sure you've probably as well. When you submit a paper or a book, and the
Yeah.
gods are the reviewers, they're saying, "Oh, but you didn't quote neither gods nor demigods, right?" And you're kind of go away. You don't know anything about disaster studies. And that argument, I absolutely agree with you. The kind of one of the things that Jason and I have in mind, join our project that will probably never start. We really want to we want to build a map of kind of citations that we're generally using in disaster studies, just kind of go through, I don't know, 5 million disaster
Yeah.
papers. Surely AI can do this for us. She said, absolutely technically inept. And just kind of see who are the gods. We kind of know, right? But like, why everybody's coming back to that one argument, and why we're not diversifying the knowledge in a way that would really help us situate disaster studies outside of the very, sometimes interesting and maybe like at that time critical, but no more exciting stuff. I'm trying to be so careful here. So yeah, thanks for starting that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, that'll be a great project.
Yeah, so join in. We'll do it. Jason and I have like a whole spreadsheet of projects that which would be great.
I mean, look at our classrooms, look at our degree programs. Who do we, what kind of reading lists are we signing our students? I mean, I work in a humanitarian studies, institute. We're very devoted to disaster studies in a very traditional way, disaster management, all of that, right? So now I created this course called Decolonizing Disaster Studies, where the whole point is not to read any of those gods.
Amazing.
Categorically step away from them and reject them, and read Audre Lorde, Audra Simpson, Leanne Simpson, any other aspirational writing that we feel has something to add to disaster studies, and then come back to the same questions that all of us ask, and then see what happens, right? I think that's another kind of
Yeah, and that's where the fun is. So in our previous season was focusing on the book that maybe eventually will come out. I don't know, I'm kind of slightly losing hope here. Called Contemplating Catastrophe, where we asked kind of quite a few friends to write 1,000 words on a thinker who is not a disaster scholar, and we had a whole range from I'm going to struggle now, from like Judith Butler all the way to Lao Tzu, all the way to Guattari and Deleuze, you kind of Foucault, Nietzsche, you name it. So we have like 86 thinkers, and people were asked, so why do we need to read this thinker to really understand disasters? And what was interesting, I think, like for me, I kind of didn't expect that those people who wrote from us were completely outside of disaster scholarship. So, we had a couple of anarchist colleagues who wrote about Tolstoy and Kropotkin. And they understood the nuance of disaster studies much better than those of us who are like absolutely kind of grounded in, in the gods literature. I'm going to just use it from now on. Thanks, Omar.
Because I think also it was amazing the amount of new insights from people who are like, even people who are disaster scholars, when they step away for a minute and they discover something different, right?
Yeah. But I think then the challenge is, do you want to like absorb it into the canon, or do you want to like shift the canon, unsettle it, destroy it, abolish it? What do you want to do with it then, right?
I mean, the canon keeps coming back, and I just I think it's kind of funny. Anyway, I feel like there is a whole paper in this, right?
3-year project, I think.
Amazing, absolutely.
Seems like a big project.
Yeah, who's gonna fund this? It'll have to be like the most ironic project of them all, It
kind of reminds me like the Reviewer 2 work that we did. Reviewer 2 paper. That was.
Oh my god. Yeah.
It's kind of like you just realize these things about your field, and it's like somebody has to do something about this.
Yeah, that reminds me of my favorite paper, even though we've written it like the humble person that I am, My favorite paper is the one I've written. Oh my goodness. No, but like you know, you're absolutely right. And we are conditioned and we're restrained because we work within the system, right? And like, how do you
I mean,
challenge the system?
I mean, well, what has the last 2 years taught us? About the death machine around us. The genocide. What has that taught us? The institution is not on our side. Is not our
No,
friend. We're
no.
all disposable. Carcerality is a form of governance in the institution. The UK University is going
Yeah.
bankrupt as we speak. Tenure doesn't matter in the UK as much. There's no safety
Yeah,
for
yeah,
anybody.
yeah.
So these are not our friends. These spaces are not our friends, and
No.
these are not our comrades. This is not where we're going to find our intellectual community, or our writing spirit, right? I think get rid of it.
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. Amazing. This is great.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to start to wrap up. You've given us a lot to think about, Omer, and I'm sure the listeners are really going to enjoy this episode. We hope that everybody will join us next time on the 14th of July. We're talking about the
manifesto.
It's
Yeah,
the
so
manifesto.
The 14th of July. Yeah, it's the special
Episode with the Journal of Disaster Studies. We're discussing the Disaster Studies Manifesto. Actually, last week at the Hazards Workshop, we had a session where we were foregrounding the manifesto and the accord. It was really cool.
Amazing.
But I feel like hopefully a lot of people are drawing from that. In our field, we keep saying like what we need to change, what we need to do differently. And I feel like I'm observing change when I talk to people, especially newer generation of scholars, coming through, reading different things, citing different sources, speaking differently, looking at their relationships differently. So I'm kind of encouraged when I look at what's going on. But we hope everybody will join us on the 14th of July for the episode. And Omer, we just really appreciate you and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so
much. My pleasure.
much.
Down with the gods.
The gods. I love it. All right. Take care, everyone.
See you later. Bye.
Bye.